Happy birthday to Joe Schuster. It's July 10th. It's his birthday. And if anyone remembers, back in October, I did a special episode that just focused on Jerry Siegel for his birthday. And now, the other half of the creative team that brought Superman to life, let's look at Joe Schuster. Now, the first thing I will say is that I always connect more with the writer on a personal level than the artist. And that's because I am a writer. I like to, and I draw worth anything to save my life. So it makes it always funny, you know, when I look at stories and I read comics, I always focus in on the words more than the art. I do appreciate the art and I look into it, but I'm always, what are they saying? What are the words saying? And then, of course, when there's panels that don't have any words in it, that's what they're saying, is with the action. And it is a story of beautiful friendship for Jerry and Joe. It's tragic, it's heartbreaking, and I think it's even more heartbreaking for Joe. Early last year, I read the book Superboys, the story of Jerry and Joe. And there's a documentary that I watched that was produced by AMC on a great short-lived series. It was Robert Kirkman Presents, like the secret origins of comics. And it was wonderful. The actors they got to play Siegel and Schuster, though, did not look like Siegel and Schuster at all. And it's just kind of funny because you look at the actors like, oh, and then you look at the real people like, whoa. Like, you couldn't have got anyone actually like those, but no, they didn't. But anyways. Yeah, Robert Kirkman's Secret History. And the third episode that originally aired November 20th, 2017, The Trial of Superman. It is the series only lasted 6 episodes. And it's heartbreaking. It would have been great to continue. But I digress. Now, Jerry and Joe, best friends, met in high school in Cleveland, Ohio. And as I've stated several times on the podcast, pretty much I think every episode, I live in Ohio. About, was it 2018? Yeah, I can't believe it's been that long. That the Cleveland Library, because Jerry and Joe used to visit the library a lot, had a huge honorary display. It was called From Cleveland to Krypton. And I saw the desk and typewriter that Siegel worked with. They had some drawing. And it was really great because if you're in Cleveland, across from the library, you'll see the building that is like the original Daily Planet that inspired them for the Daily Planet or the Daily Star, depending on what you're looking at. And it just felt like you connected with them. So I'm going to get into Joe, and we'll talk about his art and him and his life. And I've attached some links in the show notes here. One is for a history on the art, a little bit about the style, and the other is his actual obituary. So, Joseph Schuster, born July 10th, 1914, died July 30th, 1990, was a Canadian-American comic book artist best known for co-creating the DC Comics character Superman with best friend Jerry Siegel and Action Comics #1. Cover date, June. And we know how it goes. Now, what's cool is my grandfather passed back in 18. And he was the first one who ever told me that Superman was created by 2 kids from Ohio. My grandfather liked to tell stories, and he was very much a storyteller. Never wrote anything that I'm aware of, but every time the memories I have of him is about, him to fun story. And I remember him telling me the story of the night, it's not how he described it, the hot night in Ohio. They were running back and forth from each other's house, and they heard a train whistle, and that's what he faster than. That always stuck with me. And then as I got older and actually learning that they were from Ohio, and we lived in Ohio, and technically my dad's from Ohio, so my family pretty much is from Ohio. It was like, okay, cool. I immediately just kind of felt a connection from that point. So let's jump back, Joe. Enough about me. Schuster was involved in a number of legal battles over ownership of Superman. His comic book career after Superman was relatively unsuccessful, and by the mid-1970s, Schuster had left the field completely to partial blindness. Joe suffered eyesight his entire life. They talk about, in many conversations, his glasses lean in close, was very, very close to the paper or whatever he was drawing on. He was very poor. He was poorer than the Siegel family. And his goal was that they could sell their can become cartoon artists and cartoonists in the newspaper, the dailies. And recently my wife purchased me the Superman dailies, which were the first volume from 1939 to 1942, which is so interesting because I did not realize that most of the art in the dailies eventually would be done by ghost artists. For the Schuster started his own studio and would have other artists come in and they would train in the style of Joe to help produce more Superman content, the comic book and the daily and Sunday news strips. Fascinating stuff. We don't hear about as much because the dailies aren't what they used to be. You think about newspapers, everybody read, they didn't have television. We had radio, we didn't have television. And if you were in the newspaper, that's where it was. And if you think about it, from a point, Joe wanted his art to be seen, Jerry wanted his words to be read, and in a point, they were both kind of Clark Kent. They were working. Schuster and Siegel were inducted into the Comic Book Entries Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame in 92 and the Jack Kirby Hall of Fame in 93. I think it's a shame that it took them that long to be inducted into it. When you think about that, with the creation of Superman, the comic book industry changed and took off. The superhero was created, and they were at the forefront, and they are the forgotten godfathers of the comic book. Hello. This creation that these two best friends and boys made. Here we are 80-some years later, and I'm a person sitting here talking about it, making a podcast about something that is so personal that has endeavored and lived on. I don't think they could have fathomed what this character would become and what this character is. Now, in his early life, Joe Schuster was born in Toronto, Canada, and was of Jewish immigrants. Now, it's important to notice, if you think about the origin and history of Superman, and we won't get into the religious background and iconography of the character. Michael Uslan did a great conversation piece where he talked about the creation of Superman and the fact that it's a Moses story before it was a Christian story that it's kind of maybe today. Now, his father, Julius Schuster, from Rotterdam, and had a tailor shop. His mother, Ida, had come from the Ukraine. His family, including his Jean, lived in Bawhurst, Oxford, and Borden Street. Schuster attended Ricerson and Lonsdale public schools. One of his cousins was comedian Frank Schuster. When he also had a brother named Frank. As a youngster, Schuster worked as a newspaper boy, Daily Star. The Daily Star. The family barely made ends meet, and the budding young artist would take the paper of anything he could find. Now here's a quote from Joe. I would go from store to store in Toronto and pick up whatever they found. One day, I was lucky enough to find a bunch of wallpaper. They were unused and left over from some job. The backs were blank, naturally. So it was a gold mine for me, and I went home with every roll I could carry. I kept using the wallpaper for a long time to write on. Sometime in 1924, when Schuster was 9 or 10, his family moved to Cleveland, Ohio. There, Schuster attended Glenville High School and befriended his late collaborator, writer Jerry Siegel, with whom he began publishing a science fiction fanzine called Science Fiction. Siegel described his friendship with the similarity and shyness. When Joe and I first met, it was like the right chemicals together. And I'm going to pause and ask you, dear listeners, have you ever felt like that, like a creative endeavor? Like, I've played in bands before, and if anyone knows the history of the podcast, for a while I didn't have a co-host. Amazing, filled in, and she did a lot with because the people originally were going to work me back then. Long story, we met James, and that was awesome, which became my co-host. What's crazy is, for as long as this podcast is, James has been on most of it. It's very rare to have episodes, James. So having two people come together it's a spark. It's an amazement there. And in music, hearings do some singer and songwriter, guitarists and singers and bears. I guess that happens. So back to the voice. The duo broke into comics at Major Malcolm Nicholson's National Allied publication, The Future, to become DC Comics, working on the landmark New Fun, the first comic book series to consist solely of original material rather than using debut swashbuckler Davala, the super crime fighter Dr. Occult, and both of these were in New Fun 5. In a 1992 interview, publisher's Future name, he said the two sample strips were not the ones eventually published. One was drawn on brown wrapping, the other was drawn on the wallpaper. DC approved them just like that. It's incredible. But DC did say, "We like your ideas, we like your drawings, but please copy over the stories in good paper." So I got my mother and father to buy some paper. The first drawing paper in order to submit these stories properly to DC Comics. What I find interesting about this quote is my mother and father to lend me the money. Also, that was the first drawing paper. I do appreciate the fact that the company to submit it properly instead of just like, nope, and not really telling him what on. I do find it interesting that they were working for comics. You know, it wasn't like they weren't doing anything in the minute Superman. No. We won't go into the whole run of the Superman, the fanzine publication of that, but we will get into that. So Schuster modeled the hero Douglas Fairbanks Sr. and modeled his alter ego Clark Kent on a combination of Harold Lois Schuster himself. With the name Clark Kent derived from movie stars Clark Kent and Kent Taylor. Lois Lane was modeled on Joan Carter, a model hired by Schuster, which Joan's story is part of the heartbreak because Schuster liked Joan. He hired, but later would go on to mingle in 1998. Siegel and Schuster then began a 6-year quest to find a publisher titling the character Superman. And think about that. With all their work they're doing in comics, they have this idea, and it's being rejected. Slam Bradley, National Allied Publications, did not want Superman. Actually, was purchased. Action Comics #1. And they were given, I think, what would amount to around 200 years. It's sad. It will cause us to sell out, sell our art, lose a part of our soul for a need. Money. When Superman's first appearance happened, Superman's alter ego Clark Kent worked for the Star, named by Schuster after a Toronto employer. Schuster said he modeled the cityscape of Superman's home city in Metropolis on that of his hometown. When the comic strip was issued, the company permanently changed the name to Planet. Now, it is known that Siegel and Schuster had several lawsuits of how the character was exploited, and in 1946, near the end of their 10-year contract to produce Superman's story, 10 years, their basically life achievement. They, with the New York State Supreme Court, that the publisher had validly purchased the rights to Superman, bought the first Superman story. Siegel had transferred all rights to a subsequently judgment found the rights to Superboy, however, belonged to Siegel, in which Siegel and Schuster paid $94,000 for the rights to Superboy. And the duo's written agreement acknowledged the rights to Superman belonged. Afterwards, the company removed the byline of Siegel and Schuster from all Superman stories. I mean, yeah. Now, we won't go into how Jerry went on to write, but Joe, he just had their character of Funny Man failed. Joe eventually started drawing underground Sato in New York, and just and he lay on the streets almost. It's heartbreaking. Now, this is a story. In 1960, when Schuster was living on Long Island, he was reported to be earning his living as cartoon. He was also trying to paint pop art, serious comic strips, and hoped eventually to promote a one-man show in some chic Manhattan gallery. At one point, worsening eyesight prevented him from drawing. He worked as a deliveryman in order to earn a living. Now, Jerry Robinson, that Schuster had delivered a package to DC. Embarrassing. He was summoned to the CEO, given $100, and told to buy a new coat and find a job. By 1976, Schuster was almost blind at California nursing home. Now, in 1967, the Superman copyright for renewal, Siegel launched a second lawsuit, which also proved unsuccessful. In 1975, Siegel launched a public campaign in which Schuster participated protesting DC Comics' treatment of Schuster. The Association of American Editorial Cartoonist President Jerry Robinson was involved in it, along with comic book artist Neil Adams. Both of those names should ring a fan. If you don't know, go look up Jerry Robinson. I'm not going to say anymore. Just go look. Due to a great deal of negative publicity over the hand of the affairs, and because of the upcoming Superman movie, DC's parent company, Warner Communications, reinstated the byline, dropped 30 years early, and the pair received a lifetime pension of $20,000 a year, later increased to $30,000, plus health benefit. The first issue with the restored credit was Superman 302, August of '76. Although Schuster was now supported by a lifetime stipend from DC Comics, the debt and close to $20,000 by the time of his death. After he died, DC Comics agreed to pay of his unpaid debts in exchange for an agreement from his heirs to not challenge ownership for Superman. Now, the interesting part is Joe was never married, and I did some extra digging because I saw one place state he was. But from reading the book Superboys and just doing some extra research, he was never married. He had no children. He had nieces and nephews from his brothers and sisters, and that extended his family. He himself had no wife, and it's very heartbreaking to his stories. Schuster died July 30th, 19 Los Angeles home of congestive heart failure and hyper at 7 years old. In 1985, DC Comics honorees in the 50th anniversary of publication, 50 who made DC great. Of course he made. In Toronto, where Schuster was born, the street Joe Schuster Way is named. On September 10th, 2013, Dumb, a love letter to Cleveland mural were unveiled on the Orange Blossom Press building near the West Side Mart in homage to Schuster. A Moore Avenue in Cleveland's Glenville neighborhood was made. His art will forever inspire others. If you just look at what Joe created, a strong man, a very, I would say, the smile on Superman's face is just unforgettable. That is the character. That is, so anytime I've gotten an argument who claimed to be Superman fan, and this is how the character, this is Superman, this is how he should look. I'm like, I don't see that in Joe's. If you want to know the character, go see what Joe did. That is the most true aesthetic you can get of the character. It's amazing how much the Man of Steel has changed since that first drawing. Looking at it here, the smile on Superman's face, but it's still Superman. It's different. The belt's a little. The shield is really different. The cape is red, but there's no symbol on the back. But there he is, a strong man. How amazing and heartbreaking would it have been to be next to Jerry and Joe. The fact there's just where the character had gone since what it meant. I highly recommend reading the book Superboys. It gets a lot into about the highs that they rode. Were good, really working them. And it also gets into the lows. His art is forever. His culture, a lot. I know I do. I wish I had the artistic knowledge, express more of the background or the skill to dive into that. I can say, for a kid grew up and saw those to this day. So thank you, Joe, for everything you've done. Happy birthday. Remember.